Chapter 22, Odds and Ends. "So, you had tea at the Stone House with Lavender Lewis," said Marilla at the breakfast table next morning. "What is she like now? It's over 15 years since I saw her last. It was one Sunday in Grafton Church. I suppose she has changed a great deal. Davy Keith, when you want something you can't reach, ask to have it passed, and don't spread yourself over the table in that fashion. Did you ever see Paul Irving do that when he was over here to meals?" "But Paul's arms are longer than mine," grumbled Davy. "They've had 11 years to grow, and mine have only had 7. Sides, I did ask, but you and Anne was so busy talking you didn't pay any attention. Sides, Paul's never been here to any meal except tea, and it's easier to be polite at tea than at breakfast. You ain't half as hungry. It's an awful long while between supper and breakfast. Now, Anne, that spoonful ain't any bigger than it was last year, and I'm ever so much bigger." "Of course, I don't know what Miss Lavender used to look like, but I don't fancy somehow that she has changed a great deal," said Anne after she'd helped Davy to maple syrup, giving him 2 spoonfuls to pacify him. "Her hair is snow white, but her face is fresh and almost girlish, and she has the sweetest brown eyes, such a pretty shade of wood brown with little golden glints in them, and her voice makes you think of white satin and tinkling water and fairy bells all mixed together." "She was reckoned a great beauty when she was a girl," said Marilla. "I never knew her very well, but I liked her as far as I did know her. Some folks thought her peculiar even then." "Davy, if I ever catch you at such a trick again, you'll be made to wait for your meals till everyone else is done, like the French." Most conversations between Anne and Marilla in the presence of the twins were punctuated by these rebukes Davy-ward. In this instance, Davy, sad to relate, not being able to scoop up the last drops of his syrup with his spoon, had solved the difficulty by lifting his plate in both hands and applying his small pink tongue to it. Anne looked at him with such horrified eyes that the little sinner turned red and said, half shamefacedly, half defiantly, "There ain't any wasted that way." "People who are different from other people are always called peculiar," said Anne, "and Miss Lavender is certainly different, though it's hard to say just where the difference comes in. Perhaps it is because she is one of those people who never grow old." One might as well grow old when all your generations do," said Marilla, rather reckless of her pronouns. "If you don't fit in anywhere. Far as I can learn, Lavender Lewis has just dropped out of everything. She's lived in that out-of-the-way place until everybody has forgotten her. That stone house is one of the oldest on the island. Old Mr. Lewis built it 80 years ago when he came out from England." "Davy, stop joggling Dora's elbow. Oh, I saw you. You needn't try to look innocent. What does make you behave so this morning?" "Maybe I got out of the wrong side of the bed," suggested Davy. "Milty Boulter says if you do that, things are bound to go wrong with you all day. His grandmother told him. But which is the right side? And what are you to do when your bed's against the wall? I want to know." "I've always wondered what went wrong between Stephen Irving and Lavender Lewis," continued Marilla, ignoring Davy. "They were certainly engaged 25 years ago, and then all at once it was broken off. I don't know what the trouble was, but it must have been something terrible, for he went away to the States and never came home since. Perhaps it was nothing very dreadful after all. I think the little things in life often make more trouble than the big things," said Anne, with one of those flashes of insight which experience could not have bettered. "Marilla, please don't say anything about my being at Miss Lavender's to Mrs. Lynde. She'd be sure to ask 100 questions, and somehow I wouldn't like it, nor Miss Lavender either if she knew. I feel sure." "I dare say Rachel would be curious," admitted Marilla, "though she hasn't as much time as she used to have for looking after other people's affairs. She's tied home now on account of Thomas, and she's feeling pretty downhearted, for I think she's beginning to lose hope of his ever getting better. Rachel will be left pretty lonely if anything happens to him with all her children settled out west, except Eliza in town, and she doesn't like her husband." Marilla's pronouns slandered Eliza, who was very fond of her husband. "Rachel says if he'd only brace up and exert his willpower, he'd get better. But what is the use of asking a jellyfish to sit up straight?" continued Marilla. "Thomas Lynde never had any willpower to exert. His mother ruled him till he married, and then Rachel carried it on. It's a wonder he dared to get sick without asking her permission. But there, I shouldn't talk so. Rachel has been a good wife to him. He'd never have amounted to anything without her, that's certain. He was born to be ruled, and it's well he fell into the hands of a clever, capable manager like Rachel. He didn't mind her way. It saved him the bother of ever making up his own mind about anything." "Davy, do stop squirming like an eel." "I've nothing else to do," protested Davy. "I can't eat any more, and it's no fun watching you and Anne eat." "Well, you and Dora go out and give the hens their wheat," said Marilla. "And don't you try to pull any more feathers out of the white rooster's tail either." "I wanted some feathers for an Injun headdress," said Davy sulkily. "Milty Boulter has a dandy one made out of the feathers his mother gave him when she killed their old gobbler. You might let me have some. That rooster's got ever so many more than he wants." "You may have the old feather duster in the garret," said Anne, "and I'll dye them green and red and yellow for you." "You do spoil that boy dreadfully," said Marilla, when Davy, with a radiant face, had followed prim Dora out. Marilla's education had made great strides in the past 6 years, but she had not yet been able to rid herself of the idea that it was very bad for a child to have too many of his wishes indulged. "All the boys of his class have Indian headdresses, and Davy wants one too," said Anne. "I know how it feels. I'll never forget how I used to long for puffed sleeves when all the other girls had them. And Davy isn't being spoiled. He is improving every day. Think what a difference that there is in him since he came here a year ago." "He certainly doesn't get into as much mischief since he began to go to school," acknowledged Marilla. "I suppose he works off the tendency with the other boys, but it's a wonder to me we haven't heard from Richard Keith before this. Never a word since last May." "I'll be afraid to hear from him," sighed Anne, beginning to clear away the dishes. "If a letter should come, I dread opening it, for fear it would tell us to send the twins to him." A month later, a letter did come, but it was not from Richard Keith. A friend of his wrote to say that Richard Keith had died of consumption a fortnight previously. The writer of the letter was the executor of his will, and by that will the sum of $2,000 was left to Miss Marilla Cuthbert in trust for David and Dora Keith until they came of age or married. In the meantime, the interest was to be used for their maintenance. "It seems dreadful to be glad of anything in connection with a death," said Anne soberly. "I'm sorry for poor Mr. Keith, but I am glad that we can keep the twins." "It's a very good thing about the money," said Marilla practically. I wanted to keep them, but I really didn't see how I could afford to do it, especially when they grow older. The rent of the farm doesn't do any more than keep the house, and I was bound that not a cent of your money should be spent on them. You do far too much for them as it is. Dora didn't need that new hat you bought her any more than a cat needs 2 tails, but now the way is made clear, and they are provided for." Davy and Dora were delighted when they heard that they were to live at Green Gables for good. The death of an uncle whom they had never seen could not weigh a moment in the balance against that, but Dora had one misgiving. "Was Uncle Richard buried?" she whispered to Anne. "Yes, dear, of course. He isn't like Mirabel Cotton's uncle, is he?" in a still more agitated whisper. "He won't walk about houses after being buried, will he, Anne?" Chapter 23. Miss Lavender's Romance. "I think I'll take a walk through to Echo Lodge this evening," said Anne one Friday afternoon in December. "It looks like snow," said Marilla dubiously. "I'll be there right before the snow comes, and I mean to stay all night. Diana can't go because she has company, and I'm sure Miss Lavender will be looking for me tonight. It's a whole fortnight since I was there." Anne had paid many a visit to Echo Lodge since that October day. Sometimes she and Diana drove around by the road, sometimes they walked through the woods. When Diana could not go, Anne went alone. Between her and Miss Lavender had sprung up one of those fervent, helpful friendships, possible only between a woman who has kept the freshness of youth in her heart and soul, and a girl whose imagination and intuition supplied the place of experience. Anne had at last discovered a real kindred spirit. While into the little lady's lonely, sequestered life of dreams, Anne and Diana came with the wholesome joy and exhilaration of the outer existence, which Miss Lavender, the world forgetting by the world forgot, had long ceased to share. They brought an atmosphere of youth and reality to the little stone house. Charlotta the Fourth always greeted them with her very widest smile, and Charlotta's smiles were fearfully wide, loving them for the sake of her adored mistress as well as for their own. Never had there been such hijinks held in the little stone house as were held there that beautiful late lingering autumn, when November seemed October over again, and even December aped the sunshine and hazes of summer. But on this particular day, it seemed as if December had remembered that it was time for winter, and had turned suddenly dull and brooding with the windless hush predictive of coming snow. Nevertheless, Anne keenly enjoyed her walk through the great gray maze of the beechlands, though alone she never found it lonely. Her imagination peopled her path with merry companions, and with these she carried on a gay, pretend conversation that was wittier and more fascinating than conversations are apt to be in real life, where people sometimes fail, most lamentably, to talk up to the requirements in a make-believe assembly of choice spirits. In a make-believe assembly of choice spirits, everybody says just the thing you want her to say, and so gives you the chance to say just what you want to say. Attended by this invisible company, Anne traversed the woods and arrived at the fir lane just as broad, feathery flakes began to flutter down softly. At the first bend, she came upon Miss Lavender, standing under a big, broad, branching fir. She wore a gown of warm, rich red, and her head and shoulders were wrapped in a silvery gray silk shawl. "You look like the queen of the firwood fairies," called Anne merrily. "I thought you would come tonight, Anne," said Miss Lavender, running forward, "and I'm doubly glad, for Charlotta the Fourth is away. Her mother is sick, and she had to go home for the night. I should have been very lonely if you hadn't come. Even the dreams and the echoes wouldn't have been enough company. Oh, Anne, how pretty you are," she added suddenly, looking up at the tall, slim girl with the soft rose flush of walking on her face. "How pretty and how young. It's so delightful to be 17, isn't it? I do envy you," concluded Miss Lavender candidly. "But you are only 17 at heart," smiled Anne. "No, I'm old, or rather middle-aged, which is far worse," sighed Miss Lavender. "Sometimes I can pretend I'm not, but at other times I realize it, and I can't reconcile myself to it as most women seem to. I'm just as rebellious as I was when I discovered my first gray hair. Now, Anne, don't look as if you were trying to understand. 17 can't understand. I'm going to pretend right away that I am 17 too, and I can do it now that you're here. You always bring youth in your hand like a gift. We're going to have a jolly evening. Tea first. What do you want for tea?" "We'll have whatever you like. Do think of something nice and indigestible." There were sounds of riot and mirth in the little stone house that night. What with cooking and feasting and making candy and laughing and pretending, it is quite true that Miss Lavender and Anne comported themselves in a fashion entirely unsuited to the dignity of a spinster of 45 and a sedate schoolma'am. Then, when they were tired, they sat down on the rug before the grate in the parlor, lighted only by the soft fireshine and perfumed deliciously by Miss Lavender's open rose jar on the mantel. The wind had risen and was sighing and wailing around the eaves, and the snow was thudding softly against the windows, as if 100 storm sprites were tapping for entrance. "I'm so glad you're here, Anne," said Miss Lavender, nibbling at her candy. "If you weren't, I should be blue. Very blue, almost navy blue. Dreams and make-believes are all very well in the daytime and the sunshine, but when dark and storm come, they fail to satisfy. One wants real things then. But you don't know this. 17 never knows it. At 17, dreams do satisfy because you think the realities are waiting for you further on. When I was 17, Anne, I didn't think 45 would find me a white-haired little old maid with nothing but dreams to fill my life." "But you aren't an old maid," said Anne, smiling into Miss Lavender's wistful wood-brown eyes. "Old maids are born. They don't become. Some are born old maids, some achieve old maidenhood, and some have old maidenhood thrust upon them," parodied Miss Lavender whimsically. "You are one of those who have achieved it, then," laughed Anne. "And you've done it so beautifully that if every old maid were like you, they would come into the fashion, I think." "I always like to do things as well as possible," said Miss Lavender meditatively, "and since an old maid I was determined to be a very nice one. People say I'm odd, but it's just because I follow my own way of being an old maid and refuse to copy the traditional pattern. Anne, did anyone ever tell you anything about Stephen Irving and me?" "Yes," said Anne candidly. "I've heard that you and he were engaged once." "So we were, 25 years ago, a lifetime ago, and we were to have been married the next spring. I had my wedding dress made, although nobody but Mother and Stephen ever knew that. We'd been engaged in a way almost all our lives, you might say. When Stephen was a little boy, his mother would bring him here when she came to see my mother, and the second time he never came. And the second time he ever came, he was 9 and I was 6. He told me out in the garden that he had pretty well made up his mind to marry me when he grew up. I remember that I said thank you, and when he was gone, I told Mother very gravely that there was a great weight off my mind because I wasn't frightened anymore about having to be an old maid." How poor Mother laughed. "And what went wrong?" asked Anne breathlessly. "We had just a stupid, silly, commonplace quarrel. So commonplace that if you believe me, I don't even remember just how it began. I hardly know who was the more to blame for it. Stephen did really begin it, but I suppose I provoked him by some foolishness of mine. He had a rival or two, you see. I was vain and coquettish and liked to tease him a little. He was a very high-strung, sensitive fellow. Well, we parted in a temper on both sides, but I thought it would all come right, and it would have if Stephen hadn't come back too soon. Anne, my dear, I'm sorry to say," Miss Lavender dropped her voice as if she were about to confess a predilection for murdering people, "that I am a dreadfully sulky person." "Oh, you needn't smile. It's only too true. I do sulk, and Stephen came back before I had finished sulking. I wouldn't listen to him, and I wouldn't forgive him, and so he went away for good. He was too proud to come again, and then I sulked because he didn't come. I might have sent for him, perhaps, but I couldn't humble myself to do that. I was just as proud as he was. Pride and sulkiness make a very bad combination, Anne. But I could never care for anybody else, and I didn't want to. I knew I would rather be an old maid for 1,000 years than marry anybody who wasn't Stephen Irving. Well, it all seems like a dream now, of course. How sympathetic you look, Anne. as sympathetic as only 17 can look. But don't overdo it. I'm really a very happy, contented little person in spite of my broken heart. My heart did break, if ever a heart did, when I realized that Stephen Irving was not coming back. But Anne, a broken heart in real life isn't half as dreadful as it is in books. It's a good deal like a bad tooth, though you won't think that a very romantic simile. It takes spells of aching and gives you a sleepless night now and then, but between times it lets you enjoy life in dreams and echoes and peanut candy as if there were nothing the matter with it. And now you're looking disappointed. You don't think I'm half as interesting a person as you did 5 minutes ago when you believed I was always the prey of a tragic memory, bravely hidden beneath external smiles. That's the worst, or the best, of real life, Anne. It won't let you be miserable. It keeps on trying to make you comfortable, and succeeding, even when you're determined to be unhappy and romantic. Isn't this candy scrumptious? I've eaten far more than is good for me already, but I'm going to keep recklessly on. After a little silence, Miss Lavender said abruptly, "It gave me a shock to hear about Stephen's son that first day you were here, Anne. I've never been able to mention him to you since, but I wanted to know all about him. What sort of boy is he?" "He is the dearest, sweetest child I ever knew, Miss Lavender, and he pretends things too, just as you and I do." "I'd like to see him," said Miss Lavender softly, as if talking to herself. "I wonder if he looks anything like the little dream boy who lives here with me. My little dream boy." "If you'd like to see Paul, I'd bring him through with me sometime," said Anne. I would like it, but not too soon. I want to get used to the thought. There might be more pain than pleasure in it if he looked too much like Stephen, or if he didn't look enough like him. In a month's time, you may bring him." Accordingly, a month later, Anne and Paul walked through the woods to the stone house and met Miss Lavender in the lane. She had not been expecting them just then and turned very pale. "So, this is Stephen's boy," she said in a low tone, taking Paul's hand and looking at him as he stood beautiful and boyish in his smart little fur coat and cap. He is very like his father." "Everybody says I'm a chip off the old block," remarked Paul, quite at his ease. Anne, who had been watching the little scene, drew a relieved breath. She saw that Miss Lavender and Paul had taken to each other, and that there would be no constraint or stiffness. Miss Lavender was a very sensible person, in spite of her dreams and romance, and after that little first betrayal, she tucked her feelings out of sight and entertained Paul as brightly and naturally as if he were anybody's son who had come to see her. They all had a jolly afternoon together, and such a feast of fat things by way of supper as would have made old Mrs. Irving hold up her hands in horror, believing that Paul's digestion would be ruined forever. "Come again, laddie," said Miss Lavender, shaking hands with him at parting. "You may kiss me if you like," said Paul gravely. Miss Lavender stooped and kissed him. "How did you know what I wanted to do?" she whispered. "Because you looked at me just as my little mother used to do when she wanted to kiss me. As a rule, I don't like to be kissed. Boys don't, you know, Miss Lewis. But I think I'd rather like to have you kiss me, and of course I'll come to see you again. I think I'd like to have you for a particular friend of mine, if you don't object." I don't think I shall object," said Miss Lavender. She turned and went in very quickly, but a moment later she was waving a gay and smiling goodbye to them from the window. "I like Miss Lavender," announced Paul as they walked through the beeched woods. "I like the way she looked at me, and I like her stone house, and I like Charlotta the Fourth. I wish Grandma Irving had a Charlotta the Fourth instead of Mary Jo. I feel sure Charlotta the Fourth wouldn't think I was wrong in my upper story when I told her what I think about things. Wasn't that a splendid tea we had, teacher? Grandma says a boy shouldn't be thinking about what he gets to eat, but he can't help it sometimes when he is real hungry. You know, teacher. I don't think Miss Lavender would make a boy eat porridge for breakfast if he didn't like it. She'd get things for him he did like, but of course," Paul was nothing if not fair-minded, "that mightn't be very good for him. It's very nice for a change, though, teacher. You know."